originally had a very different video planned for today, but this past week I made a discovery that was just so wonderful, I couldn't help but pass it along as fast as I could. I've discovered the work of the husband and wife team of Iona and Peter Opie. And the best way that I could describe their work is that they were ethnographers of spontaneous children's culture. The book that I read as my introduction to their work is called Children's Games in Street and Playground. And that's a pretty good way to think about the kind of things that they were doing when they were analyzing children's culture. They would look at things like games, they would look at things like song, anything spontaneous, anything that just sort of emerged on its own from when kids get together and play. And this particular study was conducted over many years in the United Kingdom, but they made some interesting discoveries. They found that a lot of the games that they were tracking were things that existed in many other cultures in parallel form, even in cultures before they had had any contact with the United Kingdom. A lot of the games in here are probably going to be pretty familiar. Like, for instance, when I came across the game described as Hi Jimmy Knacker, I realized they were talking about the playground game of Buck Buck, or Horse, as it's sometimes called, or Johnny on the Pony, as it was known in the New York area. And it's described in tremendous technical detail about how the game is played and what sorts of rituals are involved when the game is started or when the game is concluded, how to decide things like a tie, and so on and so forth. And there's also a lot of recording of all of the different variations that the children will come up with for the chants or the taunts or the incantations that are performed whenever a game is played. So, for instance, for this particular game, one of the incantations when you're jumping on the backs of the other players, mop stick, bear our weight, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And then another variation, badger, 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 1, 2, 3, all off and have another go. And hucky duck, 3 times off and on again. So there's a tremendous sense throughout the book of the wonderful variety that each one of these games has in terms of its naming, in terms of all the little variations of how it can be played, in terms of the way certain rules are decided. And even if you're familiar with the games in question, again, it's refreshing to see how many other details, how many other incarnations there may be that you didn't previously know about. One of the wonderful things about reading this book is how it brought back to mind all of the games that I remember from playgrounds and schoolyards of my own childhood, and all of the little rituals that were associated with them. For instance, when the kids would play rock, paper, scissors to figure out who would go first, there was a little incantation that would go with that, and it was no backs, no penny tacks, meaning that once you commit, you can't back out. There are no do-overs. You do it once, that's it. You lose, you lose. Now, there's a couple of specific reasons I wanted to bring this book up in this channel. And the first is that I'm discovering that ethnographic studies of pretty much any kind are really useful material when you're putting together science fiction and fantasy stories, because you're looking at pieces of lives. You're looking at lives in context. You're looking at lives with that context unpacked and explained and given richness more than you normally would. And so whenever I come across an ethnographic study of some particular subculture or some particular corner of the world that I didn't know about, I kind of jump on it because it's always fascinating to see new details, to see lives that you have never really encountered directly before getting examined in this kind of detail. The other big reason that I wanted to touch on this particular work is because it talks about something that I don't often see addressed in a great deal of detail in world building, which is, again, the spontaneous generation of children's culture. There's often a lot of attention to the way adult cultures in fantasy or science fiction are spontaneously generated, or that they're the product of a historical process. But there isn't always as much attention to the spaces that children have for themselves in which they create something. And that space is necessarily going to be bounded by the adult world or dictated by the adult world, but there's still going to be freedom there. There's still going to be room for them to evolve and grow and do their own thing and transmit it unwritten across generations. One of the astounding things in this book is how many of these kinds of games, again, are evolved in parallel or just seem to spread in such an exacting way across the whole of the United Kingdom without any formal version of any formal transmission. So that, I think, is something to think about when you're constructing your own work. Don't just think about the way that the adult world works. Don't just think about the way the children's world works when it is exclusively dictated by the adult world. Think about how the children's world in your world is created by the children themselves. And books like this, I think, can be a really good guide for how to do that, because you can see concrete examples of how those things developed, how they were transmitted, how they evolved, how they evolved in parallel, how they were developed in parallel. It's all in there. By the way, if I haven't said it before, this book is great fun to read, not just because of all the nostalgia that it evoked, but because of the humor and the candor and the sensitivity that the authors bring to the observations that they make about the way the children play and about how the adults regard all of it. So again, the book in question is Iona and Peter Opie's Children's Games in Street and Playground, and I plan on picking up much more of their work in the future and seeing how it can be related back to the main subject here. For now, go ahead and check this one out. It's in print, it's relatively easy to find, and see what you think.